we can agree that David did not build a prestigious capital. In the Bible, he is above all described as a conqueror. But what about his son, the illustrious Solomon, whom the Bible tells us was a great builder?
The biblical story of Solomon reads a bit like a story from the Arabian Nights. Solomon is the wise king par excellence, he of the famous judgment of Solomon. But he was also someone who was so famous that even the Queen of Sheba came to visit him, to meet with the man whose wisdom was talked about even in far-flung Africa. Solomon's empire is said to have been so enormous that no other empire could compete. And Solomon was also the builder of the temple, which allowed the God of Israel to find a resting place within Israel.
Discovering the Temple of Solomon, an impossible task today. Religious sensitivities, in particular in respect of the Temple Mount, preclude the investigation of certain areas. We therefore have to look for clues in the bowels of the city of David.
You see, we are standing inside what is left of the Middle Bronze Age fortifications, and you can see how high they still stand, 3,700 years. Part is destroyed, but part survived, and the lower parts are even better preserved.
What's amazing is the size of the stone. Some of them are a few tons in weight, right?
Yeah, these two stones, for example, reach, let's say, 2 to 3 tons each.
And what's interesting here, all these talks that, because we are in Jerusalem, monuments could have been simply eradicated by later builders, robbed and so on and so forth. Here we see that this is impossible. When you have a monument like this, something remains.
Any big building from any period of time left after it, whether destroyed by nature or destroyed by man, in one way or another, parts standing and parts in a state of collapse. You must find something.
Like David's Jerusalem, Solomon's capital was an insignificant village. But what about the rest of the kingdom? In the 1960s, the archaeologist Yigael Yadin undertook excavations in Megiddo, one of our books of stone. Before him, in the 1920s and 30s, the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago had already carried out a thorough campaign of excavations, during which the remains of a gate to the city were discovered. This gate, of which only one side remains, has an unusual design. It is a pathway that is framed on each side by 3 chambers. It is therefore known as a 6-chambered gate. Yigael Yadin did not choose Megiddo by chance. His previous excavations at the Hazor site resulted in the discovery of a similar gate. Yadin then turned to another site, that of Gezer. This time, he only went so far as to consult the report of an archaeologist who explored the site at the beginning of the 20th century. Yadin discovered a similar gate in the design for a later small fort. A gate that was similar in design and size to those of Megiddo and Hazor. For Yigael Yadin, the conclusion was obvious. Megiddo, Gezer, and Hazor all carried the signs of the same architect, King Solomon. Yigael Yadin was guided in his investigation by a biblical verse. The verse tells us that Solomon raised a levy to build the house of Yahweh, and his own house, and the wall of Jerusalem, and Hazor, and Megiddo, and Gezer. So, Solomon was a builder king at the head of an empire. When writing about David and Solomon, the Bible serves as a history book. But once again, reality proves to be slightly more complicated. Recent stratigraphic investigation has shown that the Megiddo Gate was built after the Hazor one. It has also been shown that this type of gate was already in existence in the 8th century. Israel Finkelsein is troubled by these inconsistencies. Everything has to be reconsidered. A new chronology based on scientific procedures will have to be determined for the strata and monumental vestiges. Archaeological methods have evolved since the excavations led by Yigael Yadin. Carbon-14 dating techniques are more and more accurate. The margin of error has been reduced to 30 to 50 years. Organic samples are therefore taken from the layers of destruction in many sites, including Megiddo. They include seeds and olive stones, which allow for a more reliable dating due to their more limited life cycles. The exact sciences, physics, chemistry, statistics, are brought into play. The results provide a drastic reversal of everything we ever knew about David and Solomon and their times.
So here's the situation. If we have the Mound of Megiddo, and we partition it into conventional and low chronology, okay, with the two strata. This one was supposed to be in the 11th century BC, and now according to the radiocarbon results, we definitely see that this is impossible, that it falls into the 10th century. Right. And the meaning is that the stratum which had been dated to the 10th century cannot be 10th century, it goes to the 9th century BC.
Yep.
That is, a whole century after Solomon. A set of certitudes based on deductions have collapsed. The pieces of the puzzle no longer fit together. After our reconsideration of David's empire, it is now Solomon's turn.
What is the situation with the 10th century now?
It's confusing. In Jerusalem, it's a small village, nothing monumental, no real evidence for big capital.
Despite the biblical evidence.
Of course, no evidence for a great Solomonic capital ruling over a great state, rich state, and so on. And here at Megiddo, the buildings, the monumental buildings which had been described as the symbol of Solomonic greatness, in fact, date a bit later. They don't date to the time of Solomon, they don't date to the 10th century. So we are in a situation of a complete negative picture, negative evidence from coast to coast.
And yet there are magnificent buildings here. And the question is, what kingdom were they related?
Yeah, they are dated a bit later, I think, but the question again is what's going on in the 10th century?
We have a real historical problem here. We have to come up with a new explanation.
We certainly do. We need to look at it again, look at it afresh.
As often happens in such cases, just as uncertainties reach their climax, a new clue is discovered. Norma Franklin has been part of the Megiddo expedition for years. She noticed that the stonework of a palace that Yadin attributed to Solomon displayed very unusual mason's marks. She looked through the records and reports of old excavations to find out if similar mason's marks were to be found elsewhere. She found that such mason's marks were only recorded in one other building, only one building in the whole country. The building is to be found in Samaria, a city located in a mountainous region. Like Megiddo, this site is one of the wonders of the Kingdom of Israel. The solution to our enigmas lies here, amongst these verdant hills. Samaria was excavated on 2 occasions last century. Many remnants from the Roman era were found from a time when the city was called Sebastia. It was built by a king named Omri in the 9th century BC and was the capital of the Kingdom of Israel. Vast monuments that were built by this king and his descendants have been found here. The Bible considers the Omri dynasty as debauched and renegade kings, the infamous cursed kings. But sources outside the Bible provide another image altogether. Omri's son Ahab is seen as being a great monarch. The missing piece of the puzzle appears to have been found.
When we come to Samaria and we see the monumental building, palace built by Omri, it's so out of keeping with what we have been told, that the Omride kingdom was the breakaway kingdom, it was a small kingdom. In fact, it's quite different. We can visibly see that we're dealing with a monumental building, a building that needed a strong and powerful king in order to establish it. So this is telling us that we cannot just follow the biblical account. We have to look around us and see what else we have from the same time period. Everything is telling us that we're dealing with a strong and powerful king, a king who had at his fingertips the resources to build an incredible palace. So we're looking at a very powerful kingdom, a very strong king.
What places like Samaria and Megiddo tell us when we look at the palaces at those places is very clear. that the kingdom which was the richest and the strongest and the best connected internationally was the northern kingdom, Israel, while Judah to the south was small, poor, and marginal.
These conclusions are quite surprising. The sister kingdom to the north, Israel, with its rich soils and its temperate climate, was prosperous and developed. Whereas the kingdom to the south, Judah, with its rocky hills and its tiny population, only developed as far as a subsistence economy. They both share the land of Canaan. One was strong, the other was weak. And yet it was the weak kingdom, the younger sibling Judah, that would write the family history and would credit itself with the successes of the great kings of the north.
When you read the history of these two kingdoms, Israel and Judah, in the Bible, you soon realize that the kings of the north lag way behind in the stakes. Each king is evaluated, and regardless of what the northern kings do, they always obtain a very poor rating. Quite simply because the story is written from a southern perspective. That is, the kings are always judged from the perspective that Jerusalem is the only legitimate sanctuary. The kings of the north therefore have no chance of obtaining a good rating in the Book of Kings.
How can we explain such a paradoxical situation? History provides the answer. In the 8th century, Assyrian ambitions destroyed the dreams of the kingdom of the north. The kingdom of Israel was swept from the map, and Judah remained alone to defend the Israelite heritage. Jerusalem became the city where all of this would be played out. We are now at the end of the 7th century BC. A young king, Josiah, that we have learnt by now, reigns in Judah. He has the mission of conquering the territories of the lost kingdom of Israel. He believes he has both the means to succeed and the duty. The Assyrian Empire was in decline. All of its efforts were focused on problems that had arisen in the northeast.
The dream of a united Israel was not possible to fulfill as long as the Assyrian Empire was there. But when the Assyrians pull out, things become possible. And Josiah, king of Judah, embarks on this great idea, great adventure. He plans to take over the territories of the now destroyed northern kingdom. And by doing that, he plans to reunify the people of Israel, all of them, under one king of the lineage of David in Jerusalem. And here the story of the book of Joshua, the conquest of Joshua, and the story of the great empire of David and Solomon play an important role, because the conquest of Joshua delineates the territories that Josiah wishes to take over. And the great empire of David and Solomon gives the model for the great Israelite empire to come.
We are almost at the end of this story. The biblical saga of the conquest, written in the past tense, provides a promise for the future, an ideal. Joshua's conquest is in fact the conquest that Josiah hoped to achieve.
So while Josiah's story in the Bible is quite brief, there is no doubt at all that the narrator wants to present him as the new David. From the very beginning of the story, we read that Josiah did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord, and later that he walked in the ways of David, his father, and didn't turn aside to the right hand or to the left. It will be shown, in fact, that in all that he did, he was the worthy successor to the founder of the dynasty, leaving the reader with no other conclusion other than we are dealing with a new David.
According to the Bible, the divine commitment to the dynasty of David was an unconditional one. That promise, recorded in the biblical text, makes the mission of his descendant, Josiah, an inescapable one. Its plan is the realization of that promise. But once again, the tides of fate decided otherwise. A tragedy was in the making at Megiddo. Egypt, which had been forgotten about, came back on the scene with a vengeance. Pharaoh Necho II summoned Josiah and killed him.
The death of Josiah completely changed the concept of the Messiah. Up until the time of Josiah, all the successors to David were known as the Mashiach, the Anointed One. And this was really a symbol of their legitimate succession to the throne of Judah. But with the death of Josiah, everything changed. All the promises that had been believed to be embodied in Josiah were suddenly disproved by events. The death of Josiah caused a huge change in the idea of a transformation from royal succession to a future hope.
For the peoples of antiquity, the idea that the time to come could be better than what they lived on a daily basis, that history has a meaning and an end, was a new concept. Today, this faith in messianic times is at the core of the Jewish liturgy. A king of the house of David will one day come to realize Josiah's dream, an earthly kingdom that will carry out the divine mission. David, King of Israel, lives forever. This creed has generated an unbreakable form of hope. It is the third pillar of Judaism. In the next and last episode, we will explore the origins of the Israelites and try to understand how a collection of different stories were transformed into a single book, the Bible. Over the centuries, the Bible's remarkable stories have formed the basis of monotheism. In previous episodes, we saw the role played by the patriarchs and by the Exodus and the Law. Questions were raised about Joshua's conquest of Canaan, and the importance of King David and King Solomon was reconsidered. This time, our archaeological quest is aimed at establishing the origins of a people. who is this people that the Bible calls the children of Israel? Where did they come from? Our archaeological investigation is going to take us on the path of another Genesis, that of the authors of a book that formed the basis of one religion, Judaism, and then went on to inspire two others, Christianity and Islam, the three religions devoted to a single God. Tel Megiddo. This archaeological site will once again provide some keys to the authors of the Bible. The 25 strata found at the site cover 7,000 years of the history of Canaan. Will it allow us to find clues to the origins of the Israelites? Our two investigators, Israel Finkelsein and Neil Silberman, are writing a book that uses archaeological tools to re-examine the Bible's stories. The issue of the origin of the Israelites is at the heart of their investigation. In previous episodes, it was shown that the Exodus, the flight from Egypt, had left no trace, and that the land of Canaan was never conquered in military terms. So where do the Israelites come from? What approach should we take to our investigation? The Museum of Cairo contains a